Right, so the Iran war is no longer a distant crisis. It is actively reshaping the economies across the world, and India is no exception. From a 10% rise in domestic flight costs to soaring fertilizer prices in the agricultural heartlands, the cost of war is hitting both fuel and food security. And the Reserve Bank of India weighs a potential rate hike to curb inflation. So how deep will this economic contraction go? Well, Wall Street analysts are sharply cutting India's growth outlook as the conflict continues to weigh on the economy. GDP is now expected to come in at around 5.9%, down from earlier forecasts of 7%. The downgrade reflects rising oil prices, with Brent crude hovering above $100 a barrel, as well as a weakening rupee. The markets are now expecting the central bank to step in with a possible interest rate hike to curb inflation. Supply disruptions in the Gulf are now threatening fertilizer production in India. Output could fall by as much as 15% as key imports are hit. The country relies heavily on the region for crucial imports like LNG and ammonia, and that's raising concerns just as farmers head into the key sowing season. And it could also push up government spending as subsidies come under pressure. India's aviation sector is also undergoing pressure, with a major ratings agency now downgrading its outlook to negative. Airlines are expected to post losses of nearly $2 billion. That's as flight schedules are cut and fuel costs continue to rise. At the same time, insurance premiums are climbing, adding to the strain. And around 15% of the country's aircraft remain grounded due to ongoing supply chain issues. Consumer prices are coming under pressure as food inflation continues to rise. That's being driven by higher farming costs, with key inputs like ammonia up sharply. At the same time, fuel tax cuts are helping consumers, but costing the government billions of dollars. And with disruption continuing in the Strait of Hormuz, those pressures are not going anywhere anytime soon. Let's discuss this further with Swaran Singh. He is a professor of international relations at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor, wow, even I am shocked, and I went through the script before. It is a lot that India is dealing with right now. We mentioned oil prices now above $110 a barrel. Are we just starting to see the real impact on consumers?
Absolutely. The crisis, as the previous speaker was mentioning very clearly, is even threatening a global slowdown, and I saw how you responded to that, thinking of it as a less likelihood. So it's a global challenge in that sense, and India, being one of the large economies, also rapidly growing and transforming, definitely will have its own share of impact. And we are already witnessing some of that happening in terms of consumer prices, as you mentioned. But government is also taking sufficient action to respond to it. Prime Minister himself have spoken of this being a serious issue to handle. And therefore, India is really focusing on how to handle, for example, a new initiative of using 20% ethanol, for example, in diesel and petrol. But I also want to underline the advantages that India has in dealing with the crisis of this sort is the diversification. India imports energy from about 40 plus nations, and India's imports from Russia has really again gone up. Russia remains a major supplier for India. I'm not saying that the shipping cost and the insurance cost are not going up when we import from other nations like United States, but even within the Gulf region, imports from not many, but imports from Iran or other countries are being ensured in terms of bilateral conversations of Indian leadership with these national and leaders from the other side. So yes, India is getting impacted, but I suppose the fact that we have very comfortable foreign exchange reserves, that we have been having arrangements of using local currencies with the several nations who supply us energy, and of course people and the nations of Middle East also have critical dependence on India's exports of rice and other food commodities. In that sense, makes it a bilateral issue to help each other in that sense. So yes, a moderate impact is there, but I think Goldman and Sachs estimates of slowdown to 5.9% are perhaps one of the sharpest estimates in that sense. The estimates are usually of 1% or 0.5% lowering of the growth rate for India. So yes, there are definitely challenges that, like any other country, India faces. But compared to Europe, for example, UK, Germany, France, Italy, or even within Asia, China, Turkey would have perhaps much severe challenges to deal with than India would have. And I think readiness of India is also relatively better in terms of being prepared to deal with the energy crisis, in terms of looking at other sources of energy within the country. You mentioned fertilizers. India actually only imports about 30% of total consumption in a broad-based estimate of all fertilizers put together. And I understand urea particularly, that India domestically produces about for 80% of its consumption, will have impact because of LNG, with that helps produce urea in Indian factories in that sense. So yes, multiple impact in multiple sectors is definitely there. The factor that about 10 million Indians live there, and some of them will be looking at reverse migration because of disruptions in the region, the construction business, services, projects, jobs, etc., are becoming uncertain. So these 10 million people, and some of them are already returning. I think little less than 400,000 Indians from the region are already back in India. So that could also impact in terms of India's remittances, which are roughly impressive, about $45 billion last year. So multiple impacts in that sense, but I see that Government of India is also taking multiple actions to deal with that situation, and hopefully we are all looking at this war coming to an end earlier. And as Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, only yesterday said that in his own estimate, it is at best going to take weeks and not months. And if that comes true, and the language on both sides, from US and from Iran, is no longer of threatening, the language is now of talking about talks. So hoping that the crisis come to an early end would mean that the impact on the global economy and the economy of India and other nations would perhaps be relatively manageable in that sense.
Professor, you've covered it. You've covered most of it, but we have to go for now. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day. Right, here's